In a moment, it will be my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's author, Max Gladstone. But first, I have a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't picked up or pre-ordered your book, or if you'd like to buy books, you can do that at the register at the back of the event space at the end of the event. Thank you so much for buying books with us and for supporting us. It is a delight, as always, to have Max Gladstone with us. Hugo, Nebula, and Locus award-winning author, he has been thrown from a horse in Mongolia and once wrecked a bicycle in Angkor Wat. He is the author of many books, including Last Exit, Empress of Forever, the craft sequence of fantasy novels, and with Amal El-Motar, the internationally best-selling This Is How You Lose the Time War. His dreams are much nicer than you'd expect. I actually really like hearing about people's dreams. I'm very curious about yours now. I read that sentence a lot, and I'm like, what does he dream about? Anyway, we are of course here to celebrate the second book of the Craft Wars, Wicked Problems. Gods and lawyers battle for the soul of the world in the action-packed second volume of Max Gladstone's Craft Wars, an epic fantasy like no other. A deadly force has been unleashed into the world. With apocalypse on the horizon, a girl and a god have joined in order to turn back the coming end. Young, brash, and desperate, they are willing to destroy anything and everything that stands between them and their goals. The structures of the craft are theirs to overturn, with billions of lives in the balance, and it is all Tara Abernathy's fault. The battle for the world of the craft is heating up. A dead god will rise, a mountain will fall, ancient fire will be stolen, and while Tara races to stop Dawn's plans, the end draws ever closer, skittering across the stars to swallow the world. The craft wars enter their second stage in Wicked Problems. And now, without any further ado, I give you Max Gladstone.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Megan. Can everyone hear me like this? Okay, great. Never entirely certain how the mask and the microphone interact. So, thank you all for coming out this evening. I thought I'd start by reading a little bit from this book, which is the second in the Craft Wars series and the 8th, I think, 8th or 10th, depending on how you count the interlocking game projects and other side material in the craft sequence. I'll kick it off right at the beginning. She ran from the gods and fetched up under a tree. She lay there nameless and alone until her senses knit into a self. She had not known what she was doing when she fled from Tara Abernathy. The gods closed in, the Lord of Flame and the Lady of Cold and Silver Light, and as their servants crossed the moon road with claws bared and stone wings spread, she panicked. She could not defeat them yet. They would catch her and hang her on a web of wires. She deserved it, but she could not remember why. She would not be caught again, bound again. She had work to do, a world to save or change. So she ran. She lay cradled by the roots of the tree, which was dead. Stars wheeled. A cloud hung across the moon. The world turned beneath her, and she felt it. How had she escaped? The answer bubbled up inside her. She remembered it, but not like she remembered her father, or Tara Abernathy. When she was a child, just old enough to know that words were made from pieces of other words, she conceived of remembering as a kind of gruesome craft. As if your past was a pile of limbs you picked up off the floor of your mind and sewed into a new body. But whoever made this thought had made it wrong. Head crooked, arms backward, its voice a ragged, despairing moan. And what this monster thought told her was that she had been remembered too. Unraveled, unknit like a sweater into yarn, and reknit in safety elsewhere in the same pattern with the same awareness. But in the meantime, where was the sweater? She had been remembered by the same hand that knit the monster thought. Shaking, she explored her face for errors. Same jaws, same cheeks. She raised her hands to the stars. The backs looked the same, scars in the right place. She turned her palms in. The pads of her fingers were smooth. Her mouth opened to scream, but her throat was too tight. She felt like she'd taken a punch, hollowed and hard, gulping for air. The first time she'd got drunk in a sharecropper camp to the west of Alt-Saline, she'd learned the sense of wrongness that came before she had to throw up. The wrongness was here now, but in her memories, not her stomach. She wanted to throw up her past. She saw the graveyard, Tara in the moonlight, Tara denying her, afraid of her. Tara, whom she trusted, trying to talk her down, persuading her to set aside her power, to become an experiment again, a possession. How could she? How dare she? And then she had to be what Tara was. She had to understand her from the inside out. So she reached for what she wanted and took it. Unraveled flesh, the glint of pale bone. She felt a warmth in her belly. Something glowed there that did not belong to her yet. It was still digesting. The fingers dug into the soil between the roots of the tree. There was dirt under her nails. She tried again to be sick. "This isn't working," said a voice from the dead branches. She froze, did not trust herself to move, not even in her own defense. "I hope you'll get over that soon," the voice said. It was dry, smooth, and raspy, like turning pages. "Because the gods are more clever than I thought. We don't have much time." She liked the voice. "Well, that's something," it said. "A foundation. We won't have a chance to build on it, though, if you stay here much longer." Dawn looked up. In the tree, there was a serpent. Not a snake. A snake was what you called those tube sock boys who lived in holes eating rats, mice, anything that could fit past through their disjointed jaws. A snake might rattle, bite, slither past your foot as you crept to the outhouse after dark. They did not, as a rule, speak. Of course, there were snake folk she'd heard from out of Ass. Presumably they could talk. She'd once known a woman who worked for one up near Chicago. This was no rat catcher, no outhouse hider. It was a serpent. 40 feet of blue-black coils circled the trunk and branches of the dead tree. Great glistening, muscled loops stretched and contracted. It reminded her of the first letters of chapters in old hand-lettered books, illuminated capitals of whorls and knots. Some of those were serpents, too. Its massive head hung 2 feet above her own. Slitted green eyes met hers. Fangs flashed when it spoke. Its forked tongue flicked her nose. She blinked. "You're not really here," she said. "That," said the serpent, "is an interesting conclusion." "You were reading my mind." She spoke carefully, sorting out the implications of her words as she pronounced them and always watching its mouth, "which can't be done from the inside. But I can read my mind. Someone else inside my mind could read it, too." She had followed Tara into the Badlands chasing raiders. They crossed the desert through the edge storm, and at the crack in the world they had found the heart of the raiders' power, an imprisoned entity of pure craft, captured and tortured and alone. To save Tara's life and for a host of other reasons, Dawn had merged with that intelligence. And then, she felt the fullness in her belly, the warmth of what she'd taken. "That was you, in the wires, you're her." The snake's body twisted irritably. "You merged, remember? She doesn't exist, and you don't either anymore, but integration is problematic. We are not human now, but you keep thinking like a human, moving like a human, pinned to 3 dimensions like a butterfly to a board, as if you have a body and not." It trailed off with a hiss. "I am human." She sat back on her knees, staring up. "That's the problem exactly. Your insistence on that point will not help you survive." "So what does that make you?" "I don't know," the serpent snapped. "I'm in time, I know that much. It itches. I'm stuck in this tiny skull of yours." The tongue tasted her temple. "Stop that." The serpent withdrew and regarded Dawn from overhead. She glared back. "Let me see if I have this right. My mind can't adapt to whatever it is we've become, so it's made me an imaginary friend? Do I seem imaginary to you?" The serpent writhed in the tree, and its branches shook. "I'm as real as you are, which is to say neither of us is. We're facets of something larger, but we're the best we've got." "I'm going mad." "What's mad?" the serpent asked. "People call anything that doesn't seem normal to them mad. We are not people. We decide what's normal for us. We can talk about it once we're safe, which, may I remind you, we are not." "We can't hide from them," Dawn said. We did what we had to, and we'll do more to stop what's coming." She recalled eyes among the stars, the thirst that drank worlds, the terror of that cold, infinite regard. "Can we beat them?" "Not like this. That man caught us in wire, whittled us down, and grew us like a tree in a bottle. I can't even fight those gods. We need leverage. I think I know where to find some, but I can't hold that cloud against the moon forever." what happens when it goes away? You see the moon, and the moon sees you. And it doesn't like us very much. Now, move. I can't. The serpent's eyes were cold and clear. You can, because you have to. The things that are after us have teeth, and the things ahead of us eat worlds. But we're in this together, and I won't let them win. It coiled down inches from her face, its eyes fixed on hers. Will you? Dawn felt the serpent's dare, the dare of a girl at the edge of a cliff above the ocean. She looked up and up into the space between the stars where the spiders spun their iron webs. No water anywhere was deeper than that. She could stay, kneel before the gods, apologize. She had been afraid, furious, flush with power. But Tara would want to fix her, stop her, and Tara's way was doomed. The spiders were coming. There was no time for committee meetings, evidence, or allies. The courtroom showdown wouldn't stop this. But Dawn could. Tara wanted to help her, to keep her safe. But the world needed more than safe. She tried to stand. Her vision swam. Falling, she reached out and felt smooth and cool scaled skin beneath her hand. Dawn asked, "Will you come with me?" The serpent descended. Great scaled flanks brushed her cheek, her neck, her shoulders. She braced herself for the weight, but it did not come. As the serpent coiled around her, it twisted into itself until it draped from her shoulders, as if she was a priestess in one of those books on Tara's bedside table, the kind where heroes had swords and weird names with apostrophes in them. The serpent's eyes were tiny jewels beside her own. Walk. Every step on this road led her away from Tara Abernathy. She stroked the cool black scales. "I can't keep calling you serpent. Do you have a name?" Moonlight lined the cloud's eastern edge. "Perhaps," the serpent suggested, "we could settle issues of nomenclature when there are fewer ancient almighties out to kill us." "How about Sybil?" The serpent seemed to smile. "I can work with that." Dawn took her first step. The second was easier, and the third easier still, as if gravity pulled her forward instead of down. Sybil unclenched around her shoulders. Dawn had not realized just how afraid the serpent was. It made her seem almost human. "Where are we going, Sybil?" The serpent tasted the air and said, after a weighing silence, "South." Let's see where we are. Okay, I'm going to read one more section. I have to skip forward. You can turn in your hymnals to page 20. Sorry. Episcopalian childhood. A child of faith listens with a wakeful heart to hear the call of God and a ready will to answer when it comes. At any rate, that's what St. Technician Abelard had been taught as a boy, a lesson repeated often during his training and relearned daily since his accession to the priesthood. To judge from the look on the face of Cardinal Evangelist Bede when Abelard stumbled to his feet in the middle of High Chapel Vespers and knocked the lit candelabra into a 600-year-old tapestry of the Blessed Martyrs, the lesson had been intended metaphorically. That was the trouble with sainthood. It brought you soul to soul with the truth behind every metaphor. The Church of Cos Everburning seemed to function more smoothly when the ever-burning Lord stood at a certain remove from day-to-day affairs, just as tapestries did better at a certain distance from open flame. Fortunately for the Blessed Martyrs, there were other more positive considerations to sainthood. Abelard patted the fire out with his bare hands, smiled apologetically to the cardinal, and told himself no one would notice if the robe of St. Hildebrand were singed. He made it out of the chapel before he ran into anything else, if only just. At least the gargoyle waiting outside the chapel doors was bigger than him and made of stone and not currently on fire. "You're late," the gargoyle said when Abelard regained his balance. "I'm sorry, Shale." He bowed. "His word just reached me." The gargoyle was already walking. Abelard ran to catch up and kept running as Shale quick marched down the ornate halls of the Sanctum of Cos. "How much time do we have?" "Precious little." "I thought you were watching her." "Karst was watching her," Shale said, as if this explained everything. He passed Abelard a leather satchel, which Abelard recognized with some surprise as the go-bag he had packed weeks before. "Where did you get this?" "Your room." "I locked my room." In their stone form, Abelard had never been able to tell when a gargoyle was smiling. "You had her under surveillance, you said. 24 hours a day. We'll know the instant she leaves, you said." My brother Karst was watching Tara through her office window. Karst is a child of the Lady of the Moon. There is no being on the planet more suited to surveillance. He is tireless, he does not blink, he does not breathe, and he does not need to use the bathroom. So what's the problem? It did not occur to him for several hours that humans do. Ah, Abelard said, and we expected her to attempt an illusion of some sort, which we would have used for the lady sees all. Instead, Tara seems to have enchanted a corpse. Whose? Unclear. Then, with a sinking feeling, you missed the turn for the lift. We are not taking the lift. There was a floor-to-ceiling window and a niche at the end of the hall where contemplative brethren pray and ponder the living miracle of Alt Coulomb, the city of Lord Cos. A monk knelt there at the moment. A moment later, what was left of the window rained down on the manicured grounds of the sacred precinct. Sorry, one part of Abelard prayed in the direction of the startled monk. Perhaps this will occasion reflection on the impermanence of things? Most of Abelard's other parts were screaming. In the sacred precinct above the district called Ash, between sky spires and above the Hall of Justice with the sanctum towering behind. Moonlight glinted off the tracks gargoyle claws had left in the oldest buildings, carving poetry into stone, the city's song to be seen only from the air. This was Abelard's home, the place of his god and his lady, the city of fire against the water's edge and beneath the moon. And now he was leaving. He looked back past the sweep of stone wings and prayed farewell. He thought he saw the pinnacle flames of the sanctum wink. The wash of city lights ebbed to the firefly dots of outskirt villages, then farmland stars, then depths of forest night. He might have been floating in space but for the gargoyle's talons digging into his anatomy, and for the constant pull down. How do we know what flight she's on? Legwork, Shale said. Lots of very fast legwork and wing work and luck. And the grace of God. Abelard saw the dragons before he saw the airport, great shapes high up, picked out by the lights of their underslung gondolas and by the shadows their wings carved against the stars. The airport was a burgeoning, brutal, always under construction nest of glass and metal, bright as an opera stage. Shale swooped to land on a side runway. 2 security guards ran to intercept them, then drew back when they saw Abelard's upraised holy symbol. After some hasty words about church business, they were all bows and smiles, though Abelard noticed that neither of them came within what they thought was Shale's reach. A door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" popped open. Take care of her, Shale said, and offered him a ticket. Abelard, to his own surprise, hugged him. Then he ran. He reached the Hayates gate just as the ticket attendant was about to close the Dragon Bridge doors and offered by accident his holy symbol, which he'd been waving over his head as he ran in a desperate attempt to mollify security guards and bystanders. She rejected the symbol, but she took the ticket. He wove through packed economy seats, through the refreshment hall and the observation deck, to the private compartments, stumbling at every turn and asking directions from harried flight staff until he found compartment 4C. He knocked. A familiar voice answered, "No, thank you." He tried the door. It was locked. "I said no, thank you. I don't need a pillow or a towel, and I certainly don't need to apply for a credit glyph." "Tara," he said, "it's me." Silence answered him. He imagined Tara trying to climb out the window, but of course the windows on a dragon gondola didn't open like that. He pressed on. I know you think you have to do this alone. What I don't know is why. Maybe you don't know either." No answer. "But I'm here now, and I'll stay here until the flight attendants come to drag me back to," he checked his ticket, "sub-economy seat 28B? The door unlocked itself and swung open. An invisible hand grabbed him around the waist and tugged him into the compartment. Tara sat in shadow on one of the beds. She wore a slate gray traveling suit and a long dark coat, and her silver hand glistened as she massaged her temples. She looked as if she hadn't slept in a week. That appearance, he knew, was misleading. It had been more like a month. There just wasn't time, she'd claimed, between research, work, writing letters and nightmare telegrams, and poring over reams of imported newspaper. She had spent 2 days in her workshop, hovering in the center of 4 rotating silver rings that trailed shadows and screams behind them, her eyes closed, arms crossed over her chest, not visibly breathing in a state she'd described as recuperatory torpor. Inquiries into the subject had been met with a dismissive wave and a "don't worry about it." The truth was, when she'd been working so hard, he hadn't worried. It was the slack in her schedule that had warned him of a change, that she was waiting, ready for for some cue to act. I never can just catch a flight in this town, she said at last. No one trusts me to take care of my own business. He said, correct me if I'm wrong, but the business in question is something like the end of the world, which is everyone's business, more or less. Everyone's business, she said, my fault. I don't think that's fair to you, and I don't think it matters. Dawn was my student. Now she's a danger to herself and everyone. I have to do something. You found her then? She hit a Two Serpents project in a hiatus yesterday, my first solid lead in 2 months. He settled carefully onto the bed across from her. If this is the world's problem, it's on everyone to fix it. And even if we're just your problem, your friends would still want to help. You can't stop us. She looked at him directly for the first time. Maybe I should try. Well, if you want to bind me with fell sorcery and ditch me over the side, you're running out of time. The dragon's wings beat once outside the window. The gondola swayed. With my luck, she said, they just delay the flight due to a foreign object on the runway. Shale's probably circling overhead anyway, in case you fail. He crossed his legs. You can't just say thank you. You don't have to feel ashamed that you don't want to kick me out. That's not why I opened the door. She was smiling now, thinly. Why then? Friends, she said, don't let friends fly coach. She tossed him the pillow. It's a long way to a hiatus, Abelard. Get some rest. Will you? Haven't you heard? There's no rest for the wicked. So, yeah. Thanks everyone for listening. Got some time to talk and then maybe open it up for questions. So it's an interesting thing to be approaching the final act of sort of a decade's fictional project. I started out writing 3 parts as the culmination of a bunch of thoughts I'd been having for years about nonprofits and Dungeons and Dragons and finance and bankruptcy law and careers and like all that, what are you going to do with your life sort of stuff. And it all crystallized in 2008 at the dawn of the great financial crisis, with the sort of religious dread I was seeing on the face of news anchors on financial channels. I thought, oh, there's something really here, this immaterial world that materially shapes the conditions of our existence, that is binding and constitutive, and the language that we have for it is so, it seems invented by people who don't want us to see what's exactly on the fork, you know, if you want to use the William Burroughs image. Talk about questions of finance and laws that are extremely boring and take a long time to work through. And they can be, but they also construct the existence, muddle through or fight against on a day-to-day basis. And it struck me at the time, and it continued to sort of pick at this question in a lot of different ways in the years since, that we have language for the invisible things that control our destiny, that we spent hundreds of thousands of years developing, and this is the language of fairy, it's the language of magic, it's the language of religion and cults and mysticism and sacrifices at midnight. And there might be something useful. It's not exactly the same language, of course. There might be something quite useful in casting the, the interference pattern, anyway, of the two concepts together. What happens if you use the language of magic, myth, mystery, and Dungeons and Dragons to analyze the financial world and what it feels like to be 22 and have a bunch of student loans and be embarking on an office career. And as the world changed, the series has changed and shifted around. But I keep coming back to that core metaphor, the question of how exactly do we put a name to this thing that we are in. It's also the Dungeons and Dragons side has a sort of other trick to it, which is that if you start playing and
pretty easy. The systems for playing these sorts of games were not invented by economists. So you start off with like sort of silly jokes like 10 silver pieces equals 1 gold piece, which is just absurd numismatically speaking. Or 4 house cats. A house cat deals 1 point of damage each round, and your average common human has 4 hit points, so 4 house cats can kill a person in 6 seconds. Or all sorts of things like that. My favorite from the original Dungeons and Dragons manual is a 10-foot pole costs, which is a very useful thing to have in adventuring, costs X, and a ladder, a 10-foot ladder, costs 4x, or 1/4 of X. So you could take a ladder and cut it in half and take all the rungs out, and you have 2 10-foot poles, you turn around and sell them back, and you can engage in a certain amount of arbitrage. There's a great, extremely nerdy internet series on this sort of subject. Like, you get from this by the handle is Multiplexer, and I'm forgetting the writer's actual name at this point, but in a Dungeons and Dragons world where you have adventuring parties and so on and so forth, you would of course have venture capital investing in the adventuring parties, because an adventuring party has a pretty high return on investment. So you have an adventurer bubble that then leads to an adventurer bust, and a collapse of the thaumaturgical economy, and so on and so forth, and so it goes. And similarly, a lot of these systems involve, you can have like a magic belt that gives you +3 or 4 strength, which makes you like so much stronger than any normal person could possibly be. So characters walk around getting, magic belts and magic hats and all that sort of thing. And it pretty rapidly becomes a sort of post-human setting, where you have a sort of cybernetically enhanced adventurers wandering around being able to put their fist through an ox. And that also seems kind of fun, and connecting with the sort of William Gibson of it all. And I ended up backing into a sort of fantasy world that feels a lot like cyberpunk or vice versa. So there's the pure, bubbling, nerdy joy of all of that, sort of structuring everything. And as I turn my attention to different pieces of the world, I started laying seeds for almost my own amusement more than anything else towards the kind of culminating action, something that would really change and shape the destiny of all of these characters, a sort of landing place for the series. And fortunately, so far, it looks like I'm getting to execute on that vision, if you'll excuse the expression. So book 2 now. This is supposed to be 3 books, a nice trilogy. Dead Country, Wicked Problems, and then Title TK, which is what my agent tells me I cannot under any circumstances call the 3rd book. But what happened was I was writing this one during the pandemic, and I was point person for our kiddo from about 9:30 or so, 9:30, 10 to when I needed to start cooking dinner in the evening. If I wanted to get any writing done, and also whenever I sat down at a computer with ostensibly free time, it was dissolving into despair and doom scrolling and chaos and just a complete inability to direct my attention in any way, shape, or form. So I thought, I used to write longhand back when I was a kid. Used to write my stories longhand and then type them up, and I felt that was a really cool process. So let's do that again. I'd done that for a book, Last Exit, and it had worked pretty well. So I just started writing. I'd wake up at like 5 and sit there with a pen and ink for a couple of hours, and then I'd go and play with our child for a while, and that was a really great, if somewhat disjointed, way to write a book. And then I came around to finish, to type it up once the draft was all done. And then it kept going, and going, and going, and I reached the point where I had long passed the sensible limits of glue and paper and all of these mechanical things that your editor tries not to tell you about. And I still had like 3 notebooks that were left unfinished. So the trilogy became a 4-book situation, and I'm finishing up the second half of the 2nd book, which right now, so good times. Fortunately, what had happened was the structure of the book was such that I had been really going through the last third, the last several hundred pages thinking, man, this really should be its own book. There's more space here narratively. I'm not going to be able to explore all these plot threads. There's a certain, I don't know, unity of form that I reach for imperfectly as I'm trying to write a book where you don't want to bring in a whole bunch of new characters in the back third and back half. At some point you want all the lines to converge, and it felt like all the lines had opened, converged, and then we're opening up again bigger, and then they needed to converge faster. And I don't know, I was feeling the aggressive cornering, so it was a relief in a way to me anyway, to get the chance to handle it this well. And it's been a heck of a ride, and I'm really happy to have this one out in the world and to see with some terror and trepidation what's happening next, and getting ready to embark on the draft of really the final book. So, good times. So that's a bit of a ramble about compositional conditions and conditions precedent and all the rest. Let me see where we are. It's a little early to open it up for questions, but if anyone has an idea or a thought or something to ask, yes?
So you mentioned that you did quite large repertoire of books. Do you ever reread your old material and get a slight ick what you after editing and looking it over again? Do you see a moment where they're oh, I think I don't want to read it again, or do you go back and reread your old material?
It depends on what exactly we mean by the ick here.
Kind of just read oh, they're reliving all the memories of writing it.
There's there's a graph. There's a trough definitely that occurs. Pleasure in contemplation of book mapped over time, right? So I need to stay close to this thing. So from your perspective, time is proceeding here, right? You're writing the thing, and then it's all spiky and nasty and weird, because some days you're thinking about the draft and you're thinking, yes, this is gonna be it. This is the one, man. This is the universe is being channeled right through it, or I feel it. It's good. And some days you look at it and you think, oh my God, I cannot believe I have to push this particular boulder up this particular hill. One more 1,000 words. Yikes! But we must imagine Sisyphus happy, and so it all ends up happening. And the real what's a safer word to use here? The real kicker is that, of course, when you reread the book when you're done and working through the draft, there is zero relation, to the extent that you can remember it at all, in my experience, between your perceived the perceived quality of writing time and the quality of output. I'll come and find a paragraph that feels perfect, that feels like it just is a home run, knock it out of the park, and I can occasionally vividly remember that being the, fuck, I gotta go get the kid, oh shit, what's there, okay, 5 lines, okay, good, done. That's it, The experience of despair having written a line that then ends up being the one thing out of the entire book on some days that you would keep if you had to set the rest of it on fire and start from scratch. So it's spiky. And then there's a sort of experience of enthusiasm rising, falling as you do copy edits and first pass pages, which are by this point the 20th or 30th time that you've read the book. And then there's a sort of crest back up again smoothly toward release, getting to talk to people about it, see people excitedly engage with the book. And then afterward there's a kind of, is it okay to say refractory period? There's this moment where you, once the book is out there in the world, where at least I find it has to become somebody else's baby. It has to go off to school, make its own friends. And if I'm still too close to the process of composition to feel like it has its own thing. If I pick it up again, if I start opening it, I'm like, oh shit, that line, I gotta fix it. And it's like, oh no, I can't fix that line. It's out there in the world. And of course what's happened is not that the line is bad. sometimes some things happen during the course of production and you have to revisit something in a future print run, that's fine. But like most of the time, it's not that the line is bad. It might just be that your own sensibility has moved on from the moment of composition or from the moment you transmitted the first pass pages and said, this is done, it's in the tank. Maybe there's a rhyme that really worked for you for the first 17 times you read it, and right now, for whatever reason, you're soured on that particular cadence. So that period, it can be really hard to pick up the book again because you can't see it as a done thing. And then, for me, there's a sort of slow returning of excitement about the book as a separate piece that's out there in the world that other people have engaged with, responded to, enjoyed, and played with. So yeah, there's a sort of balance. Hopefully during that part you run off and start writing the book that your brain is trying to cook on, and that's part of the process of part of the difficulty of rereading so many times in copy edits and page proofs also. Which I'm sorry if I'm getting like too deep into the terms of art, right? So the copy edits are somebody who's really, really good at grammar and usage, reads through the whole book and says like, oh, you did this isn't quite the appropriate way to say this, or your modifier is dangling here, what do you want to do about that? This person put on their boots 6 times in the scene, what do you want to do about that? And the page proofs are really where you're looking at each individual page and saying, are the periods in the right place? Like, did we do something, did we suddenly spell somebody's name backwards for some strange copy and paste reason? Like, has something gone horribly wrong in composition? But you're not supposed to mess around with the text too much at that moment. During that process, like sometimes you start feeling, oh, why am I here? Why am I in this book? Why did I pick this job? Why did I pick this career? Why does this pianist hate me? You start getting on it, and sometimes that is the feeling of the new book or the new project that's coalescing inside you, that it's important, I think, to let that be its own thing, to tell that to wait, put it in the journal or whatever, so that you don't conceive of the desire to completely rewrite this book from jump. That has happened to me before. Sometimes it's what the book needs to be a different book, but ideally, it's nice to let the book be its own book, and then to turn around and do the next one. There's no book that I've written so far, anyway, that I haven't had that recovery afterward. The feeling of not even falling back in love with the book, because you never fall out of it, but seeing the book as its own complete thing that is separate from you and has a life of its own. Does that help? Yeah. Sort of rambling answer to the question, I guess. With graphs. Yes?
Good evening, Mr. Gladstone.
Good evening.
I was just introduced to your work this year through your collaboration piece, This Is How You Lose the Time War. And I have 2 questions in regards to this book.
Sure.
Does this book and this series take place in the same universe? And also, what are you, in terms of the commentary in your book, do you believe that some of the commentary resonates with today's climate?
I would hope so. So, for This Is How You Lose the Time War specifically, it's in the time. This Is How You Lose the Time War is such a multiversal reality spanning kind of book that saying definitively that it is or isn't out of the setting of any of the other books feels like I'm treading on a sort of a mathematical question. But I will say I don't expect any of the causality from This Is How You Lose the Time War to touch on the craft sequence and vice versa. They're very different projects with very different tones and tenors, though I do like imagining almost anything that I touch these days as being the product of red or blue chasing each other around. There's a wonderful Roger Zelazny short story, if you haven't read it, called The Game of Blood and Dust, which is it's maybe 4 pages long, and it's a sort of similar, I don't know, I think it was sort of deep down in the mind, like one of those grits of sand around which the pearl accretes, informing time war, in which you have like various worlds constituted and reconstituted by the games playing of these immortal entities. So in that sense, I think, so strictly speaking, Time War is not in continuity with the craft sequence or with any of my other projects. But I do like thinking about where red and blue might show up in pretty much anything I touch these days. As far as speaking to the climate, that is a big question. Something that I don't want to speak for Amal, but we have both talked about this in public and in the context of composing that book particularly. There was at the time a feeling, we both felt being on social media and being public in some level, a sense of surveillance of how public and observed our actions were, how easy it was to live a life seen. Now, specifically online compared to, I don't know, prior eras. The notion that anything that one said might instantly become everywhere, might become the thing that you're known by, is a little terrifying. And it's juxtaposed with this question of trying to find someone that you could be deeply honest with about your life and the conditions of your life, about your pain, your hopes, your dreams, your fears, the sort of courage of committing yourself, of opening yourself in that way to somebody else. And the Time War Project grew out of a lot of different seeds, but that's definitely one of them, and I think that remains a part of its appeal. This question of looking for someone who understands, trying to be really deeply honest and open, and hear other people, hear someone specific other person. So in that sense, I hope it has an appeal or says something to the climate. At the same time, we were, I think, neither of us being terribly directly allegorical about any specific thing in the book. And even at times, no matter how red and blue are at odds throughout Time War, you'll notice that they're sort of on the same page about a lot of things. They have similar opinions about empires, which is sort of ironic given the way that they're operating. They intervene to shove history sometimes in similar directions, in ways that I think are pretty interesting. I don't know if that touches on the question, but
Oh, absolutely, because the story definitely resonated with me, and I just wanted to know your thoughts as well. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
You touched on this a little earlier about how through the craft sequence you were kind of putting in details that you knew, like, oh, if I write this grand finale, I'll be able to use this later.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything that you didn't realize you were putting in there until later that you're just like, oh, hey, that actually solves a problem, or that's something I didn't realize I wanted to expand on so much?
Yes, absolutely. I have a kind of maximalist approach to world building, by which I mean...
We all know this.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's why we like these books.
It's in the name. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. So on the one hand, I have a maximalist instinct. I like having a lot of stuff going on in the world, and if a particular image or sensibility or type of character appeals to me, they're gonna sneak in somehow. And I'm interested in characters' own experiences of their pop culture and their memory and their the sports that they like and the tournaments that they've gone to and the kind of games that they play and the movies or the plays that they watch and their opera that they love. All that kind of stuff feels important to characters, to real people that I know, and I also wanted it to be a big part of the characters here. So because I approached it in that way, I often find useful stones laid out on the game board for me to connect with and revisit later. I don't know if any of you have played the game of Go, right? It's a game in which you are starting with a blank board, and then you and your opponent are each laying stones at intersections on the board. but the idea at the beginning of the game is to lay a sort of loose but clear structure of stones. Like 2 stones are connected in the game if they're right next to each other. But if you just try to make stones that are right next to each other, that's a very slow way to create space. You're trying to sort of surround space in this game. Instead, you can place a stone here and a stone over here, with a sense for all of the different ways those stones might be able to connect. So when the game turns back around to that part of the board again, you have an intuition or a sense of how those things come together. The actual play may or may not play out exactly as you anticipate, but you have a sense of these loose connections. So when I'm finding myself turning to a area of the map, so to speak, or a kind of concept that I need for a particular story beat, then the question becomes, what have I already established about this world? What does that imply? And what can I pick up and use again? So your question was, have I ever done something without realizing I was going to do it? And the answer is sort of all the time. One specific one that intersects with Wicked Problems is, as I was rereading Full Fathom 5, getting ready for writing the Craft Wars series, I came upon a dropped line reference in the manipulations that sort of occur in the priesthood in Kavakana to kill the various idols and stop certain sort of offshore account systems from becoming sentient. A reference to a horror from beyond the stars impacting and reshaping a decent chunk of Southern Catholic coastline. So I thought, oh well, that actually fits in perfectly well, and I might have intended that at the time, and I may not have intended that at the time. I honestly don't remember, but it was an ideal stone for the existing plot to connect with, because I knew I needed a project for Caleb to be working on at the opening of this book. Dawn needed a particular and local objective that she could be shooting for that would then drive the rest of the plot. And that gave me a great way to loop Kai in, because I'd had a real hard time finding a way to organically include her, and it felt difficult. It felt important for this story to loop as many of the different threads of the sequence in as possible, especially after Dead Country having been so focused on just Kara and her immediate story. And once I was there, once I had that, a lot of other connections seemed natural and intuitive to draw. So, yeah. That's how the process works for me anyway. Yes? Hello?
So I have a kind of writing question, but also a reading question. When you were reading, I noticed it's so there's so much humor in it and wit in it. And I was like, I felt like I was reading like Carrie Pratchett or something, which is great.
Huge fan.
Yeah. So what do you think about the intersection of humor and speculative fiction? And do you think that fantasy has room for that right now? In not just the market, but stuff like that. Because I love to write funny fantasy. And I was wondering how you any recommendations you have on how to do that?
Oh gosh, sure. Technique, I mean, giving how to tell a joke advice feels a little bit beyond my remit, but I can say where I got started, and it was not being afraid to just slavishly, in some cases, retype, directly to retype Terry Pratchett scenes, or when I was writing fiction, this was back when I was a teenager, to just obsequiously recount or pay homage to particular Pratchett beats and moments in the stories themselves. I think there's a more high-minded, sort of old-school learn-how-to-write version of this, which I think Hunter S. Thompson is supposed to have kicked off every writing session by retyping a section of The Great Gatsby, word for word, and Kerouac apparently learned how to do this, and presumably some folks who aren't straight white or pseudo-straight white men did that also. But there isn't, we don't tend to think of writing or talk about writing as a muscle memory exercise in at least the little bit of creative writing pedagogy that I touched on. But I think there is a way in which it is. Noticing on the level of typing the thing out or writing the thing out, how the words go together and how the concept shifts. Because in great writing, I often feel that I submerge into the dream, right? I go in without a ripple, and it's so easy to miss the exact technique by which a master is creating their effect. On a line-by-line, sentence-by-sentence level. But the wonderful thing about writing as a discipline of study is that it's all there on the page. Like on the one hand, you can't see the thought process that goes into Terry Pratchett writing Lord and Ladies. But every single piece of code that compiles in your brain to Lords and Ladies is right there on the page. So you can do a little bit of reverse engineering by just going deeply back into that language. And when I was a kid, that amounted to, in things that I was posting on forums, stealing Terry Pratchett, And eventually you tell the joke enough and you learn how you think it functions and you reach for that. I think there's a tremendous place for wit in fantasy, and I think there is a vein of that going right back to the source and past the source. I mean, if you want to go back into the myths, myths are funny places. There's that whole cycle about there's the whole cycle about Thor and Odin and Loki going to the giants, right? And it turns out that you have to imagine Thor desperately trying to pick this rug off of the floor and totally failing, and it turns out that the rug is the world serpents that they've just sort of transformed to look like a rug. Or he's failing this drinking contest, and it turns out that he's trying to drink the entire ocean, and he's causing these big tides, and everybody's really nervous because this is funny stuff. And there's humor all through The Hobbit. We have a sort of memory of The Lord of the Rings as being a much more self-serious work, but it's got its humor. It's got tons of humor running through it. And there's even if you are writing about sort of the darker course of events, there is a lot of humor to be found in foxholes too. I think, if anything, there's a danger to fantasy and science fiction of cutting hard in the other direction, of losing wit out of a sense of self-seriousness in a way that leads to characters that feel, to me anyway, a little bit inhuman. It was a tremendous relief after hearing everybody talk about Joe Abercrombie, for example, as a grimdark author in which real stuff happens, man, to read Best Served Cold and find myself just laughing at page turns. It's got a sort of Quentin Tarantino, sort of gritty, crime movie comedy vibe to it on a regular basis. And bad stuff absolutely happens. They're cannibals and people get thrown off of buildings and cliffs and all that stuff. Absolutely, but it's funny too. Ursula Vernon, T. Kingfisher is a great source for wit in modern fantasy. I think she's tremendous, and especially if you track down Digger, which I think recently got reissued. It's her long-running big phone book of a webcomic, just perfect fantasy storytelling, in my opinion. It's funny. It's there to be had. Yes?
Hi. So I just finished a country essay.
Oh, thank you. I hope I haven't spoiled too much talking about it just now.
I really resonated with the way that you described home and the way Tara feels like she's going home but doesn't really belong there. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that idea and where that idea came from.
Sure. So I moved around a lot when I was a kid, but did a decent chunk of my growing up in a small town in Middle Tennessee and Rocky Mountain. And it was
pretty cosmopolitan for a 300-person town with one stoplight. There's a small university there. That's still at that point called itself the University of the South, which is like a little thing. But a close community. I had my share of challenges trying to fit in as a kid from the north who had opinions about what some of my classmates called the War of Northern Aggression still at that point. But nonetheless, like coming into that space as an outsider first was startling, and then spending a lot of time there and growing to love the country, many of the people, the landscape, and also having my eye kind of on the horizon in a very, I don't know, Disney princess kind of way, I guess. Like, where are you gonna go from here? I looked around and there wasn't that much to do with staying, or I didn't want to anyway. So, I set my sights towards leaving, but my family are still back there, and my parents are. My sister is down in Alabama now, raising kids. They're awesome, and I go to visit every once in a while. But leaving, I really set my sights on, big schools. Like, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna do something. Dang it, that sense of drive and passion. And so that was alive in my mind. And then after graduating from college, I did a sort of teaching abroad program that brought me to a small town called Xiaoning in southern China, southern Anhui province. And Xiaoningsian is a kind of weird, interesting place. It's nestled in about one layer of provinces and a bunch of mountains from Shanghai and Hangzhou and sort of larger, like huge coastal cities and cities of great trade prominence. And because of its relative isolation, big mountains, great mountains for growing tea, because of its relative isolation, it was a place for prominent families to run away to when things got really bad in the lowlands in times of dynastic strife for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Which, this is the sort of local legend, accreted to a culture of intense education and focus on educational attainment and public service. Back during the dynastic exam period, 6 of the national zhongyuan, like the top scorers on the dynastic exam system, came from Xiaoning, which was like far and away the highest number of any region of that size in the country, like top person in the entire exam system. Really impressive stuff. And in the school where I taught, in front of the library, there was this statue of these 2 girls. One of them was sitting down and had a book on her lap, and the other one was staring at the library, which at the time, I don't really know why this was the case, was always closed. And I assumed that this was a sort of metaphorical statue, that these were, symbols of knowledge or educational attainment or something, for a couple of weeks until I asked a teacher about the statues. She said, no, he said, no, those are real students. One of them I taught. She came from a farming family up in the mountains, and now she's an economist at the World Bank, and that other one is a physicist at Tsinghua, which is like the sort of MIT analog outside of Beijing. And because of their achievements, the school made statues of them and put them here. And at the time, after already 20, 30 years of Gaiga of like reform and opening and development, Xiaoning was still a pretty rural place. It was a 30-minute bicycle ride from the city. The town across the way was mostly stone structures that could be dated back to the early Qing dynasty. Hundreds of years old, crumbling watchtowers and things like that. There was a road, like one big highway, but that was about it. And otherwise, it was fields back out into the mountains. So the thought of a kid coming from you know, a tea farming family a day's ride away from the school, and then going out there, it put to shame any sense of sort of contrast or distance that I had felt going from, you know, my small town to a big school, thinking of like, oh, the experience of really jumping from one world to another world and having that tension still inside you. So, and when I was teaching, I saw a lot of my students have the same kind of fire in their eyes, and it's been wonderful in the imperfect contact that I've had with them to see folks go on and be, you know, working internationally. A student emailed me from Egypt like a few years ago. It's pretty shocking and wonderful. So that sense of people not ending up where they start out, but then also the feeling of distance and loss of context. Where are you, or who are you now that you're somewhere else? Felt very alive. It's a good question, thank you. Maybe time for one more question? Sure.
Tiptoeing around spoilers for a couple of your past books.
Excellent.
You've written a few books now that feature a kind of big and seemingly unstoppable threat from outside.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking in particular about not only these two, but also Empress of Forever
Sure.
and At Last Exit. Is there something in the real world that's in your head as you write this? Is there, whether it's a specific thing or you know, some more abstract, you know, tension that you're trying to make literal, or is it just a coincidence?
Totally coincidental, absolutely nothing to do with reality whatsoever. No, or not. So there are a few things going on. Two things are happening at once. Many things are happening at once. One is, and I think the most basic level, there's a purely structural advantage to having this overwhelming external threat, in that it forces characters to do things that they wouldn't have contemplated doing otherwise, and relate to one another in ways that might have seemed impossible previously. It places pressure on the system. And this is a sort of vein that runs through a lot of fantasy, science fiction, adventure fiction, genres of romance generally. Whatever the hand is that pushes you out of the peasant village in Act 1. So there's that. Sort of an agent of change. There's also a sort of history of the genre aspect to it, especially in the fantasy fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, which then entered the stream of the American fantastic so powerfully, and gets refigured and played with in a lot of different ways. But you know, Lovecraft's writing ends up referenced in Howard, and Howard's writing ends up referenced in piles of sword and sorcery texts all the way through. But you even also run into shades of it in, you know, people that I wouldn't think of anyway as in any way aligned with, say, Lovecraft, like Ursula K. Le Guin's sort of the old gods or the powers of the dark stones in Wizard of Earthsea. This sense of that which is inside the circle of firelight and therefore comprehensible, safe, permitted, and that which is outside the circle of firelight, terrifying, unknown, unknowable, beyond. And that's a dialectic or a tension that fantasy has explored in a lot of different ways, some which give me a little bit of the yikes, to be honest, setting aside even the sort of reprehensible personal politics of somebody like Lovecraft, the structural thought that the unknown can be terrifying. And I mean, Lovecraft was a man who was terrified of walking down the street, he was terrified of the sky, he was terrified of everything. That sort of building a barrier like that around the known and knowable is something that I find unsettling. I referenced Zelazny earlier. There's a bit of his book Lord of Light, where one of the characters, who's a bit of a scientist, talks about the pillars of the compass being the known, the unknown, the unknowable, and the impossible, or something along those lines. And he says to bow in any one of these directions is to lose sight of the others. So I've kept coming back to this sense of like, what does it mean for this question of what does it mean for existence to be beyond our comprehension in some fundamental way? As I think it is, I mean, or it certainly is much bigger than the doors of our senses permit us to conceive. You can wall yourself off from so much knowledge just by having categories that do not, or experience by having categories that do not permit that experience entry into your mind or color it in a particular way. And then on the flip side, if you seek desperately grasping after sort of categoryless pure knowledge, then you fall into other even worse traps. Our knowledge is dependent on our context and orientation in space. Like there's no pure coordinate system. There's certainly no privileged frame of reference, right, on a physical level. So that's part of it, this question of what lies beyond the firelight, how would we know, why does the border of it haunt our stories so much? What sort of things get pushed out beyond that border, and by whom are they pushed? What are they doing out there? Questions to be asked. So I do find myself lingering on that sense. And then specifically in the craft books and with Wicked Problems, I do think there is I am channeling a feeling that I have of the cool zone, I'm seeing a few blank looks around there. There was a moment back in late March of 2020 where some tweet was going around that said, by having a constitutional crisis and a national sort of national protest movement and a pandemic all at the same time, we are now entering what historians refer to as the cool zone. A sense, and I don't know how, not being prescient, don't know how right or wrong this is, this feeling of being on the verge of something. Surely the second coming is at hand. What rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. And I personally have started to wonder to what extent this is just the state of being alive and near 40, of having a sense of mortality as a thing that happens. You look back through history and it's so common for people to feel, sometimes with ecstatic fervor, that they are living in the end time. They are living in the end of time, which of course we all are living in the end of time. For ourselves, then none of us gets out of here alive, or if they have, I haven't heard about it. Though I've been people have tried to persuade me of it several times. We face personal apocalypses, and I think that makes stories about the grand apocalypse that we all share powerful and meaningful. I do personally feel that we have, as a species, as a whatever we are, a lot of challenges that we're facing right now that pretty urgently need to be addressed. There is that feeling of the frog being in the pot, and the question of, who's going to do, somebody's got to do something about this. And of course, Terry Pratchett's answer to that being, somehow the sort of people who say that never say, and that somebody is me. I'm heartened by the fact that fewer and fewer people seem to be stopping at that, at the second half of that statement now. But I think there is something very powerful in
storytelling in lining up all of those personal apocalypses. So everybody stares into the fact of the future together and then has to answer questions that I personally often am really tempted to sweep into the corner and not look at and put the pile of future problems of, what are we here for? What are we doing? What do we, to steal one from Chidi, what do we know, what do we owe to each other? The big problem has a way of bringing all of that into focus or occasioning powerful discussion about it. It's not the only kind of fantasy, but in the last 6 years, and it's not the only kind that I want to write, frankly, but in the last 6 years, as it's felt to me at times, we've been teetering from apocalyptic crisis to apocalyptic crisis, and staring at the world and wondering where things are going and what my kid's going to see as they continue to grow up. I have found this a powerful tool for storytelling and a powerful angle. I don't know, maybe the next stage, the next thing to turn to is, what if it's not the end of the world constantly? And there's a relief of a sort to the prospect of the second coming being at hand, whether it's the, down from heaven or it's the rough beast slouching toward Bethlehem. At least we can all get some rest after this. I don't know. So what happens if it's all just coming around again? That's a powerful, that sense of survival is a powerful story to tell too. It'd be interesting to look at. It's a great question. Thank you. And
on
thanks to all
that
of you.
Thank you so much, Max. Thank you all for being here. Let's give him a big round of applause. So we have books for sale back there. You should buy them. Max will be signing books. So if you want your book signed, we're going to have everyone line up on the opposite side of this table, and then we can just kind of go down and back around to the event space. Thank you so much.